Hello and welcome to the sixth episode of the Connect the Dots NYC podcast. I'm your host, Vedant Vohra, and I'm so excited to take you on this journey as we explore different solutions to homelessness. As the creator of the CTD NYC app, I've seen how technology can connect people to vital resources. CTD NYC helps individuals experiencing homelessness in New York City access shelters, food, and healthcare, bridging the gap between them and essential services. It's a powerful example of innovation needing compassion to tackle the homelessness crisis. Each episode will dive into stories, strategies, and innovations from those on the front lines, whether they're advocates, policymakers, service providers, or individuals with lived experiences. My goal is to spark meaningful conversations and shine a light on the incredible work being done to make housing more accessible for everyone. Thank you for joining me today, and let's get started. Our guest today is Rob Robinson. Rob Robinson was a co founder and member of the leadership community of the Take Back the Land movement and is currently a senior advisor at Partners for Dignity and Rights. After losing his job in 2001, he spent 2 years homeless on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City shelter. He eventually overcame homelessness and has been in the housing movement based in New York City since 2007. In the fall of 2009, Rob was chosen to be the New York City chairperson for the first ever official mission to the US of a UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. He was a member of an advanced team coordinated by the US Human Rights Network in early 2010, traveling to Geneva, Switzerland several times to prepare for the United States' initial experience in the Universal Periodic Review. Rob has worked with homeless populations in Budapest, Hungary, and Berlin, Germany, and is connected with housing and land movements in South Africa and Brazil. He has worked with European Squatters Collective, International Alliance of Inhabitants, the Landless Workers Movement, the movement of people affected by dams in Brazil, and the platform of people affected by mortgages in Spain. He currently serves as the coordinator of the US-Canada Alliance of Inhabitants on behalf of International Alliance of Inhabitants. He is a regular guest lecturer at the City University of New York Graduate Center and several university law schools throughout the US and Canada. He was recently appointed an adjunct professor of urbanism at New School in September 2021. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Vedant, and thank you for that generous introduction.
No problem. So I want to get started on your personal journey and the background to your story. So can you take us back to 2001 and walk us through your experience of becoming unhoused? What helped
Sure.
you get through those 2 years on the streets and in the shelter system?
So, Vedant, I grew up in a working class family on Long Island. My dad was a chef in a restaurant before becoming an owner, so I sort of grew up in the restaurant business. But through my high school years in college, I played football. I went to high school, Lawrence High School out on Long Island. I broke or fractured my hip every year of high school and still got a scholarship to go to the University of Maryland. And I attended my freshman year. I broke my hip and my pelvis, and doctors told me that's it. You can't play football anymore. You're basically done. So as my working career began, I graduated college. I started working in the restaurant business, but eventually doctors told me I had to get off my feet. I have to find some type of working situation that didn't involve standing on your feet for long periods of time. So I worked several customer service jobs and ended up with a company called Automatic Data Processing, ADP, the payroll company. Um, I joined them in 1988. It was a Fortune 500 company, and my job was what they call a teleservice rep, to take payrolls from small mom and pop organizations over the phone and key them into what was called then a CRT terminal for processing through a mainframe computer. Well, through that position, I worked myself up into an IT position and eventually became what they called a project manager overseeing the development and installation of a piece of software called ADP Access. It was a call center call center based piece of software that ADP said would move it into the new millennium. So we're coming into the change of centuries at that point. And in 2001, March 2001, they asked me to move to Miami to beta test this software in a new organization that they had acquired called ADP Total Source. So at the time, there were 60,000 employees at ADP worldwide, very few people of color in high-level management positions. So I jumped at the opportunity. I didn't do any research about Miami. In 2 weeks, I picked up my life. They gave me a $10,000 relocation fee. They gave me a car to drive for 3 months, and they put me in a hotel for 3 months. So I thought this was great, right? I'm on my way, I'm advancing through this company. The fourth month, I got called into the general manager's office and told, there's no more money in the budget for your position. We're going to have to let you go. And as I said, I didn't do any research on Miami, but at the turn of the century, there was a problem with the Castro government, people that were imprisoned, and he decided that he was going to open up the prisons and set people free and send them to the U.S. A lot of those folks ended up in Miami, so the job market was saturated with people that were willing to work for smaller wages. I had severance pay, and I used unemployment that lasted for about a year. That started to run out. Then I tapped into a bank account that ran out, and then the next thing you know, I'm tapping into my 401k, and all of a sudden, I'm broke. I paid off a lease that I had in an apartment, but I had no more money, so now I have to fend for myself. And it was a difficult time. I ended up on the streets, but I kept a positive attitude because I said I advanced with the company to a position that I did. So I'm going to figure this out, right? I'm going to figure out how to get out of this. I constantly stayed positive. And, for a long time, I struggled. I wanted to know why this was happening to me and people that looked like me. But one of the things that really struck me is I used to panhandle in an area of Miami called Little Havana. There was this Kmart and Winn-Dixie shopping center that had a lot of foot traffic. So I said, a lot of people walk through here. I could probably panhandle enough. And then I would sleep alongside Miami Beach. I'd have to take a bus to and from the beach every day, take the bus home to sleep or to, Miami Beach to sleep and then come back in the morning to panhandling. Panhandling, I called my job at that time. I do it from 10 in the morning till 8 in the evening, right? And it was tough. Some days were better than others, but I survived it. But on the way to the beach, this is something that struck me and really sort of motivated me to try to understand homelessness and housing more. Every night I go over the I-395 bridge on the bus, and I see this development happening on the 39th Street Bridge of luxury buildings coming. And there was bunting on the buildings that said, beautiful luxury studios coming, studios in 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom apartments coming. Studio starting at $850,000, 1-bedroom at $1.2 million. And over a period of time, they're constructed, but they're vacant. And then all of a sudden the bunting changes. Sign a 2-year lease and get 2 months rent free. I'm like, okay, they must have saturated the market and they can't sell these things. So it really got me inquisitive and wanted to understand why this was happening in Miami. And as I discussed it with people, I kept hearing this term gentrification. And I spent a lot of afternoons at the library in downtown Miami before I go panhandle to try to understand gentrification. So that kind of gave me the impetus to drive and try to understand the situation.
And what led you to transform your personal experiences with homelessness into a commitment to advocacy and movement building?
Well, so that was interesting, Vedant. I kept asking the whole time I was on the streets of Miami, why do all the people look like me? I came to this conclusion in Miami, and when I saw it take place when I got back to New York, also, and I came up with this theory, and that theory was gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. So it seemed to me that there was a predetermined path for some people that led people into this abyss called homelessness and housing insecurity. The other thing that I heard when I came back to New York and I got in shelter, I would constantly hear this narrative. You're homeless because you don't want to work. You're homeless because you don't have an education. You're homeless because you have a chemical or an alcohol addiction, or you're homeless because you have mental illness. So, working my way through those narratives, I said, well, because somebody has a mental illness, we shouldn't disregard them. We should try to help them. I don't have a chemical or alcohol addiction. Um, I I have an education. I have an undergraduate degree that I got from the University of Maryland. And I went to work with my dad on weekends ever since I was 9 years old. So I'm not lazy. So I said, I have to change the narrative. And I have to find more people like me to be open about this situation, which was a challenge to help them understand. But that whole process transformed me, Vedant. I started to ask a lot of questions why this happens to people and looking back at history and just educating myself. Even when I was in shelter in New York, I was in a shelter across the street from Port Authority bus terminal on 40th Street and 9th Avenue. And there were some homeless folks that would sit in that shelter and stare at the green walls every afternoon. It took me a while to understand why. I understand it now, but I didn't understand it then. But I would go to the library on 40th Street and 5th Avenue and study gentrification. I just self educated myself. And that whole process of what I went through, what I was hearing, and what I was learning as I was studying transformed me and said, I have to look at the world different. The way I was taught things, the values that were instilled in me have to change. I have to do a brain dump and learn the world all over again.
And in 2007, you entered the housing movement in New York City. What was the landscape like at that time, and how did you find your footing within it?
So it was interesting. When I came out of shelter, I joined an organization called Picture the Homeless. Picture the Homeless was an organization that was educating and sort of empowering homeless folks to have a voice for themselves, to make policy change, and to really talk about the situation and say, we understand why people are in this situation and we understand what the solutions are. So it was an opportunity. And I think the biggest opportunity for me came as a member of that organization. I was asked to speak publicly at Columbia University. I'd never talked publicly about anything like this, and I'm sitting next to some heavyweight people. Now, I'll go down this list because it'll blow your mind for somebody who's never done public speaking. I'm sitting next to Dr. Peter Marcuse, professor emeritus at Columbia University, a lawyer and an urban planner, and son of Herbert Marcuse, a well known sociologist. Next to him was an African American woman who was an organizer with DC 37, New York City's Municipal Workers Union. She was the lead organizer with that group, and she was one of the founders of the Million Workers March movement. And to her right was Ed Ott, who at the time was the CEO of the Central Labor Council, an umbrella of all the unions in New York City. So three powerful people, and they had me speak last. I'm sweating bullets, man. I'm soaking wet from perspiration. I'm so nervous. So I say what I have to say, and when I'm done, Dr. Marcuse, he's sitting next to me, puts his hand on my thigh under the table and whispers in my ear, "Great job, great job." But I made that same statement. I articulated that theory. Gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. And when I said it, there was a distinguished professor of anthropology and geography from the City University of New York by the name of Neil Smith in the audience. And Neil stood up immediately after I said it and said, "Say that again." And I said it again. And then at the end of the talk, he came up to the table and says, "I want to know how you came up with that theory. What made you, how did you find the time to come up with a theory like that?" And I looked at him, I said, "Neil, the only thing, I had nothing but time on my hands. So I wanted to make use of the time that I had." And then the other thing I said to him, I said, "I kept noticing that everybody going through the situation looked like me. So what is happening here?" And I wanted to know more about it. And that led to Neil being a mentor of mine. I make the argument today that I'm teaching at the new school because of Neil Smith, and Neil telling me he wanted me to come up and lecture his students. Neil was teaching PhD students at the grad center, and he said, "I want you to come up and lecture my students." I looked at him and I said, "Neil, I can't lecture PhD students. I have an undergraduate degree." But then he put his grill against mine and he says, "You taught me. You're going to teach my students." And the rest is history, as they say. He became a longtime mentor of mine. We lost Neil in 2012. It was hard for me to handle that loss, but I give him a lot of credit for where I am today and being able to talk about this situation.
Wow. And Now I want to shift a little bit towards your advocacy and your international work. As I mentioned earlier, you've done advocacy at the global level, including preparing for the US's appearance in the Universal Periodic Review and collaborating with movements across Europe, South America, and Africa. So what are some of the biggest lessons you learned from international housing movements?
I think one, the popular and political education that takes place internationally, it's ongoing. It's institutionalized there. It's a big difference from here, and I'll tell you something that Brazil does that we can learn a lesson from. In organizing here in the US, which most people use what is called a Saul Alinsky style of organizing. I won't go into the weeds about that, but that generally sends a message that you meet people where they're at. In Brazil, they use a process called formação, political formation. Let's educate everybody, bring them to a political place, and then we move together in formation, formação. And for me, that was a huge difference because when you try to meet people where they're at and you're with 10 people, you find out they're in 14 places. How do you get anything done, right? It becomes complicated. So I saw that methodology working a lot better in Brazil. I've also seen how political education stays front and center. So in Brazil, the landless workers movement has a school and they teach and they bring international leaders in to learn from their school and their style. And everybody in that school learns everything about community, mutual aid, how to grow food, how to take care of each other, right? And it's a little bit different. We live in a society that's somewhat selfish. I got mine, Vedant, you go get yours. I worked hard to get mine. And that's not the mentality in a lot of these countries outside of the US. I also think there's a difference in, I'm going to take you a little bit into legal weeds here. One of my challenges is regarding our Constitution. Our Constitution was written 250 years ago, and our civil law is based on that Constitution. I say that Constitution is flawed because slavery was still going on at the time, and people that looked like me were considered three-fifths of a man. So it starts out with a line that is very questionable to me. We the people. So I continually ask, who were those people? Because a majority of society weren't included. But then I look at the Constitution of Brazil, written in post dictatorship, 1985, that says land has to serve a social purpose or a social function, growing food or housing people. Compared to ours, it values property rights over people's rights. So it looks like Brazil's constitution is leaning more to valuing humanitarian ways. The Constitution of South Africa, post dictatorship, written in 1966, 1996, says housing is a human right. It's a clear line in the Constitution. So I make the argument a lot of times when I lecture at law schools that the more modern constitutions, people were thinking different. I have no disrespect for anybody who fought through the civil rights era, but it's more than human rights. I value human rights, what are people's needs versus what is written into your civil law that may work for some and may not work for others. So I've always found a problem with that, and I've always lectured on that at different law schools around the country.
And I want to continue on that line about your international work. And so what does it mean to be a part of a transnational network like the International Alliance of Inhabitants? How do these global connections strengthen local struggles?
So it's very clear, and that's a good example that you chose. International Alliance of Inhabitants is a worldwide network of 12,000 members who stand on a zero eviction platform. Nobody wants evictions to happen, but they do happen. So, how do you organize yourself to push back? Well, you organize yourself transnationally because you find out that a lot of the actors are global actors. So, for instance, I'll talk about Blackstone. They own more property than any other organization in the world. So the PA, the platform of people affected by mortgages in Spain, constantly organizing against Blackstone. But this gives you power when you have 12,000 people worldwide who can stand behind you and sort of push back on a system that is pushing down on you, but also understand that Blackstone operates here in New York City. So when La Paz comes to New York City, they reach out to Rob, and I take them to Park Avenue to the main office, and we organize protests out in front of the place. So there, you bring your struggles together. The struggles are the same. That's the one thing that I've taken away from the international work, and that's what we have to get out of our head. Where we have this exceptionalist attitude, I think that filters down from our government. We do anything better than anybody else, and I think the situation we're going through now with the federal government pushing back on the immigrant communities kind of unpacks all of that and says, no, 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 no. Your true colors are rising up right now, and you don't necessarily treat people right. So I think there's a lot to learn. I was lucky enough to start to learn that early on and challenge our Constitution, challenge this idea of a democracy. And just to give you an idea, when you talk about a democracy, I go back to 2014 when I got a call from organizers in Detroit saying that Detroit Water and Power is shutting water off from people because they can't pay their bills. And I said, whoa, 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 you need water to survive. Water is a human right. And then all of a sudden, people they rose up and they started to say, yeah, you're right. So Detroit at the time and Flint were going through some tough economic times. And there is a law in Michigan that says if a city claims bankruptcy, the governor has the option of appointing an emergency manager to handle the affairs of that particular city, which means, Vedant, that the representative government that I or you may have voted for no longer has power. There's this one person that's put in place that is directing how the city operates. That's not what I voted for. That's not the democracy that I stand for. So I think it's incumbent upon us to look into these situations from time to time. And, it was a situation we ended up bringing the UN to Detroit and Flint in 2014 because the people in Detroit and Flint said, our leaders aren't listening to us. So we need to reach out to the international community and bring them in and shame them in front of the rest of the world, right? Especially the case of Detroit, because Detroit with the auto industry was always called the Paris of the U.S., right? But all of a sudden you see this city that was recognized as this beautiful city really going down because they're struggling financially.
And you've worked with groups like MST in Brazil and the Platform of People Affected by Mortgages in Spain, as you'd mentioned. What do you think American housing advocates can learn from these groups?
I think, and I mentioned this earlier in our conversation, I think the political education, you have to understand your conditions. What is our contextual reality? What is the context that we live in now? What does the world that we want to see look like? Right? And how do we get there? And that requires sitting down and having really intense conversations. It's, protests are just a tactic. And I get that. I came into this work constantly protesting, but I'm like, that's just a tactic. What is our strategy? What is it we want? I'm often in places where I hear people say, what's wrong? Everybody can articulate what's wrong. How do we change it? And what is it? What is the world that look like that we want to live in, and how do we get there? I don't hear too many people talking about that, but that's what I hear outside of the U.S. I hear them having a vision. I see them having a vision and making space to have the discussions to discuss the processes to get there.
And I want to talk now about your modern roles. And so, in your role as senior advisor at Partner for Dignity and Rights, what does your work focus on today?
It's a human rights organization, so it's a lot of times what are the treaties in the U.S. that can support the work of people on the ground, right? The U.S. has only signed off on 3 international covenants and treaties when there were close to 200 of them. So you're constantly up against this behemoth that often will put our Constitution over human rights, which I think is problematic. The rest of the world believes in human rights and abides by international human rights standards and law. It can seem to function that way, and why can't we? So there are a few main programs within that organization. the right to work with dignity, the human right to health care, the human right to education, and the human right to housing. So they support grassroots organizations with reports and data. And, what are the treaties that say, okay, you do have a right to this? And, a lot of times that's having a conversation with members of those organizations, educating them on international human rights standards and laws. I'm blessed to have a relationship with many, I guess you would call them processes in the UN. I will say, and for this conversation, I don't think the UN can fix all of our problems, but there are mechanisms within the UN that can support our struggles and force change. So UN rapporteurs, you read my bio early on. Raquel Rolnick came here. She was the UN rapporteur at the time on the right to adequate housing. So it's very popular. The Obama administration has signed off on her mission here. It was an official mission. She went to 7 cities and she heard the same problems in those 7 cities, right? But to go further on, after her was Leilani Farha, who's from Toronto. Leilani was very powerful. I worked a lot with her and the government in Barcelona, Spain. The actual mayor of Barcelona at one time was the communications director from La Paz, um, Ada Colau. And I'm often in situations when I say, I stood on the steps of Blackstone on Park Avenue in 2013 holding the end of a banner, and Ada Colau held the other end of the banner. And I've often said to students, now she's mayor of Barcelona, Spain, right? So anything's possible. So I think, there's so much that can be learned from these movements outside of the world. And then the current UN Special Rapporteur is Balakrishnan Rajagopal, who teaches up at MIT. So I have a relationship with all of them. Going back to Leilani Farha, when her mission was over, she did 2 terms as a rapporteur. She started a not-for-profit organization in Toronto called Make the Shift. Let's shift from talking about a right to housing to making it a reality. And I'm on the advisory committee for that organization. So it's a sense of pride for me to know that um, somebody at that level respects my voice from the ground and the fact that I can organize and rise up people. So that's a lot of the work at Partners for Dignity and Rights. I connect the UN and UN processes to that organization and members that they support.
And you'd also mentioned you're an adjunct professor at the New School teaching urbanism. How do you approach teaching students about housing justice, and what's their usual response to your lived experience and
Well,
activism?
I think that's fantastic. I just had a conversation yesterday with a student that graduated probably 5 years ago, and she's remembering some of the things that we talked about. I love to be open about it because where in this world do you have a college professor who will say that he's formerly homeless and will talk about the experience and shared with it, and then understands housing insecurity at an intimate level that a lot of people don't. So I think they find value in it. I enjoy it. Many of the students I connect with in unbelievable ways. There are two. One is she's very busy in New York City. She runs an organization called Unlock NYC, which looks at how people are discriminated against with vouchers. So, source of income discrimination. It's called Unlock NYC. Mano Vijario, who started that organization, is known as my baby sister. She and I are very close, and she started that organization, started to collect data from members who were being discriminated against. And my contacts inside the city hall, I was able to get that report right in front of the mayor. And at the time, Jessica Katz, who was the chief housing officer, there was no denying it. Here it is, right here in writing. Here are the voices. Here are the people. So I think it does a lot that way. There's another student, Masoom Moitra, who's from India. I went to her wedding in India, and she graduated in 2016. So you build a relationship with these students, and as they go through their professional careers, they trust you a lot. They come back to you to ask you questions. They may not have the answer for something along the way, but they want to talk it over with you. But I also find that I'm involved in a lot of personal conversations with former students. So Mariana Bontempo lives in Brazil. She knows I have strong ties to Brazil. And there was a time she was debating with her mom about who the president should be. Both she was for Lula, her mom was for Bolsonaro, and she's saying how fed up she was with her mother. So she would call me to voice her displeasure, right? Because she knew I understood. So I cherish that role, Vedant, to have that opportunity. I never saw myself in that light, but the fact that students, even long after they graduate, still stay in touch, it means you've given them something that they value and they want more and they know they can trust you and that you're probably going to give them the right answer, so they're going to come to you. And I think for me that's pretty amazing, just knowing that it was never my plan to be a university professor, and the fact that I landed in that space is incredible. I'll just add, um, just before we were supposed to connect last week, June 10th, so I guess it was prior to that, I received an honorary doctorate from the City University of New York Graduate Center. So, it's just your years of work. And when the president of the university first reached out to me, he sent me an email last November. And in that email, he says, "We pride ourselves on social injustice, but it's become clear to me that when it comes to homelessness, your name is constantly mentioned with respect to homelessness and how you've educated people in this university. And we like to offer you this opportunity and this graduate degree." And I'm like, what am I going to say? No? Yeah, of course I'm going to say yeah. So it was interesting. You never do the work, Vedant, to look for accolades or rewards, but it's always nice when people do recognize what it is you do.
Wow, and congratulations
Thank
for
you. Thank you very much.
I now want to shift onto some systems and narratives. And so you were part of the delegation that hosted the UN Special Rapporteur, as you had mentioned, on the right to adequate housing in New York City. What came out of that moment, and why was it especially significant?
Well, as I said, it was the first official mission. So the federal government was saying, okay, we know that housing organizations and individuals have reached out to the UN to say there's housing insecurity in the US. You can come and investigate it. That was powerful because in those 7 cities, we brought this delegate of the UN into those cities to see it, touch it, and feel it, to understand from the people what they were going through. And that resulted in March of 2010, a report in advance of the General Assembly in 2010 that Ms. Rowling had put out with 108 recommendations to our federal and local governments regarding housing. And that was a powerful tool for organizing. Now you have this person who was recognized as a housing expert worldwide saying, you have problems, US. You need to work on these specific things. And I might make the argument today hasn't been easy implementing all of those changes. I would argue that maybe 50 of them still exist, right? And, some of them are being exacerbated now with the federal government when you're cutting budgets and doing some of the things that are happening. But I think that's the most powerful, right? Bringing in an outside voice to look at this problem holistically and give a view that can be shared with the rest of the world. For a country that claims everything is perfect, it's this great democracy, right? Well, not really. Here's what we saw, or here's what she saw, right?
And obviously, the goal here is to see housing as a human right. And so, what would it take for that vision to be fully realized here in the United States?
Well, I think, there are 7 core components, right? We have to understand that everybody has a right to a clean, affordable home, security of tenure, um, culturally competent housing, right? Many of these cities in this country will, okay, we're going to build affordable housing, but we're going to put it in an area, outside of the city or outside of a culturally accepted city. And I think we see that filtered down to the local. Just to give you an idea, our city is rezoning the Gowanus Canal area of Brooklyn. The Gowanus Canal was called a Superfund site 20 years ago. But now a city's holding out its chest saying we're going to build affordable housing, and they're going to expose people that they've been discriminating against for years to cancerous situations in housing over the canal. So I think it's, health conditions taken into, something that is, I said, affordable, healthy, security of tenure, they're culturally competent. There are 7 core components that the UN says that fits, housing, the right to housing. I think many people will say, oh, you just want to give people housing? No, we want to, we have landlords in the city that have a building with 200 violations on it. That's not healthy housing, right? That's problematic housing. So how do we fix that? And I think we have to hold people like that accountable in a real way. And the city needs to do a better job. The city needs to understand what housing as a human right is, even in a city where we have a city commission on human rights. So let's stop the discrimination in housing. Let's, stop source of income discrimination. There are so many things that play into that go in the opposite direction of housing as a human right that we have the ability to fix.
And now I want to focus on organizing and moving forward. And so you helped co found the Take Back the Land movement. What was the spark behind that initiative, and how does it continue to resonate today?
So that was my probably my favorite piece of organizing. Take Back the Land was an answer to the U.S. government, particularly the Obama administration, um, during the 2008 financial crisis. As a member of Picture the Homeless, we were watching a group in Miami, Florida, that was taking over vacant houses and moving families into those vacant houses because they were foreclosed and evicted, and the house was sitting empty while people were sleeping on the streets. So 4 of us traveled to Miami in early 2009 to learn from that group. But Max Rameau led that organization, he and I became very close, and we decided to take the organization national in May 2010. We announced it on what is known as Labor Day around the world, the real Labor Day. But what was significant of that, and the point of that was the Obama administration took our tax money to bail out some of the biggest banks in the world, basically sending a message that Bank of America, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, you can't fail. But Vedant, you can fail. We're not worried about you. The banks can't fail. But then those banks turned around after they got our tax money and started foreclosing and evicting us in record numbers. And in many states like New York, you have to buy an insurance policy that guarantees that you're going to pay off that mortgage. So if they evict me, they get the insurance policy, they still have the house, and the Obama administration bailed them out. So we came to a conclusion you can't have the money in the houses too. It doesn't work like that. And we saw that it was happening mostly to people of color. So the idea was to find houses that were foreclosed by a bank or a government agency, break in them, move the families back in there, and defend their rights to be in there using international human rights law and standards. And while we couldn't get the work to scale, I think the work still resonates with people. There is an archive at the University of Miami Law School on the work of Take Back the Land. But we did win a house in Rochester, New York for a woman named Catherine Lennon, which was, to me, one of the most significant victories in my organizing career. So she was a victim of Bank of America. Her husband passed away in 2010. Bank of America, she fell behind in a mortgage. Bank of America started eviction and foreclosing proceedings on her in 2011. Late March 2011, they decided they were going to evict her. And we decided we're going to defend her right to be in that house. So we knew that an eviction had to happen in New York between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. So we had at least 100 people around the house, 8:30 in the morning till 5:30 every day. And this went on for a week. We saw one day, the very first day on Monday, that I guess the marshal had drove up, 2 marshals drive up. They see 100 people around the house and they think better of it. They get back in their car, they drive away. The next day, a moving van comes, supposed to pack the belongings from the house and put them in storage. So the next day, the moving van pulls up. Three guys jump out of a truck. They look around and they see all the people standing up. They decide to get back in the truck and they drive away. The following week, the city of Rochester sends a SWAT team and 25 police cars to physically remove Catherine Lennon from the house. And a 71-year-old white neighbor came outside pointing her finger at the police, saying, "This is not America when you forcefully remove somebody from their house like that." And she was arrested for interfering with governmental administration. And that whole scene went viral. We started getting responses from people across the globe. "This isn't right. How can we support you?" Yada, yada, yada. We had some congressional members from the area and some people in Fannie Mae. They seemed like they wanted to help us. We worked with them for about a month. Nothing became of it. So we finally sat down with Catherine and said, "What do you want, Catherine?" And she said to us, "This is my home. I want my home. This is our dream." So Mother's Day 2011, we did a very public move-in. When we broke in the house, we moved Catherine back in. And for me, probably one of the best scenes was seeing two men walk down the street with a refrigerator on their back. Neighbors were coming and refurbishing the house. We had a big picnic on at the house that day. And then the city of Rochester police chief came and he said to myself and Ryan Acuff, who was the leader of the group, Take Back the Land had different chapters around the country. So Ryan Acuff was the leader of Take Back the Land, Rochester, New York. And he said, this is private property and you could be arrested for trespassing on private property. So we looked at him, we said, "This is private property?" He says, "Yeah." Then we looked at him and said, "Why are you using public funds to defend private property?" And he looked at us, he scratched his head, told his men, "Let's go." And then it became a court case where we worked in court. We kept going to court, showing up on time. Bank of America asked for 6 postponements. And finally, they asked us what we wanted, and we said we want the house. When they evicted Catherine, they wanted $50,000 cash. November 2014, we signed a deal for $1, and Catherine lives in that house today. So it was a significant victory, and we showed that people organized can win even against big banks and other institutions. So, one of the keys to that, though, was when you take Bank of America bought the mortgage portfolio of a bank called Countrywide Lenders, and they did something they call robo-signing, where they paid people $10 an hour to sit in a back room and re-sign all of the mortgages. And we knew about this process, and it was done by a law firm called Stephen A. Baum. And so we started targeting Stephen A. Baum, about this process. And all of a sudden he filed for bankruptcy, Chapter 11. And when we got to court, Stephen A. Baum law firm said, "We want nothing to do. We don't have anything to do with this court case. Take our name off that." And then we knew Bank of America was standing there alone, sort of with their pants down, and we had them, so it was just a matter of time. And, when they asked us what we want, we said we want the house. But we made it clear along the way that we were going to take a radical approach to this. If you continue to evict people, the bank branch closest to the house that you evicted somebody from will not do any business. We'll put hundreds of people out in front of that bank branch and scare everybody away. So we'll basically shut down the bank branch. And that's when they started asking us, "What do you want? How do you want to negotiate?" And we said, "You have the Center for Constitutional Rights, you have the U.S. Human Rights Network, and you have the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty in D.C. Those are our legal reps. Talk to them. We trust them. We don't trust you. So if you want to negotiate with us, you go through them." And I think it worked as a success for us. But, there were reasons why we couldn't get it to scale. People were afraid of what might happen to them if they if they broke in a house. In some cities, like in Greensboro, North Carolina, we tried to support them through the phone. And when they took over a vacant house, you see police marching up a hill in formation, 100 police to go get 3 people out of a house, right? So, you have to you have to realize some cities it's easier to do that than others, and that was a big part of the challenge. But it's nice to know that people still reference that work, right? That work I'm constantly hearing about Take Back the Land, and the fact that the University of Miami Law School has an archive is very meaningful to me. It means a lot to me.
And throughout this conversation, we've talked a lot about your work in international advocacy, but also advocacy in the United States of America, and like how you were just mentioning with this collective movement with Catherine. And so, as my last question, I want to ask for listeners who want to take meaningful action on housing in their own communities, where do you suggest that they start?
I think in every city, there are good social justice groups doing the work, right? So in New York, we have good tenant organizing groups. There's a Right to Counsel Coalition, which was formed out of folks coming together and pushing back on the evictions, high number of evictions that were happening in New York, especially in Bronx Housing Court, where a group called CASA was the main force behind that bill. So I have a long relationship with CASA. I think Housing Justice for All is a statewide group that does this work, really working around housing and homelessness. But on the ground level, there is Vocal New York, which works a lot on housing and homelessness. There are groups out in Brooklyn. There are plenty of groups in the city that are doing good work, and I think they could use the support of members standing behind them. And I always encourage people to say, forget the narrative that was painted about you, who a homeless person is. I hope that by this conversation, that I've shown you a different side of homelessness and who can be homeless. And I think it's important for that. The one thing I learned from this whole thing, Vita, and this will be, maybe a good way to close out, but that's up to you. At one point in Miami, I'm on the streets for 3 days without eating, without any nourishment, without any sustenance. I'm in the hot sun. And I decided that I was going to go panhandle in the shopping center that I told you about. And as I walk into the shopping center, one eye is probably going in one direction, the other eye in another direction. I'm like drunk from all the heat and lack of sustenance. And this elderly Cuban couple is walking towards me and they go, "Tu hambre?" Which means in Spanish, "Are you hungry?" And I said, "Yeah." They happen to have a hot chicken dinner in their hands with yuca, rice, beans. It was the first meal I had in 3 days. And something I learned, the lesson I learned from that is I grew up at a time on Long Island, as I told you. My dad would often take me and my two brothers to go get a haircut. So four of us got a haircut in the barber shop. We step outside, and somebody identified as the town drunk or somebody who was lost in his ways would ask for 50 cents or something. And one of us would pull on my dad, "Can I have 50 cents to give him?" And my dad would constantly say, "He's a bum. He doesn't want to work." And I reflect on that a lot now when I talk about transformation, to say, I won't pass anybody on the streets without asking them if they're hungry. I see plenty of people laying on the streets in New York, and I say, I will stop by. "Are you hungry?" I may not give them money, right? But I will take somebody in to get a meal. We all need a good, healthy meal to get by. And I know what it's like to be without it. And, I lived that life. So I don't want to forget where I came from and how I got to where I am today. So I think that's a big takeaway for me.
Okay, thank you so much for your time and sharing your experience. I really appreciated it.
You got it, brother.